Every person in that solicitor's office believed Miss Emmeline Darrow would sign the paper. She was in debt. Lord Phineas Varcourt, Viscount of Strathmore, was not. In the arithmetic of a small harbour town, dear friends, that settled everything before the ink had dried. I have been keeping stories by this fire for longer than I care to admit. I have told you stories of ambition, of pride dressed up as honour, of love that arrived wearing entirely the wrong clothes. But this one has stayed with me, because it begins not with a wedding and not quite with a refusal, but with a room full of people who had already decided what Miss Darrow's poverty meant, and who were about to discover they were entirely wrong. Come closer. Let me tell you what happened in Bellwood Harbour in the autumn of 1823. Mr. Bernard Darrow had been, in his lifetime, the finest apothecary between the river mouth and the northern cliffs. He mixed his own compounds, kept meticulous records, and charged the fishing families half what he charged the merchants, a habit his creditors had never admired, and his daughter Emmeline had always quietly loved. When he died in July, he left behind 2 daughters, a modest house at the top of Harbour Lane, a small dock on the South Wharf that his own father had built, and enough debt to make the town speculate before the funeral was even over. Miss Emmeline Darrow was 26 years old. She had managed her father's dispensary since she was 18, kept the accounts since she was 20, and understood the difference between a ledger that looked healthy and one that actually was. She was not beautiful in the way that made rooms stop. She was handsome in the way that made people listen. Sharp eyes, a composed mouth, and a manner of addressing a problem directly that some found refreshing and others found deeply inconvenient. Her younger sister, Miss Delia Darrow, was 19 and frightened in the way that only the young can be frightened, entirely and without disguise. The solicitor's office of Mr. Clement Rowe occupied the ground floor of a building on Canal Street that smelled of mildew and self-importance. On the 14th of October, every person connected to the Darrow estate's affairs was summoned there. 3 members of the town's Harbour Commission, 2 neighbouring merchants who held smaller notes, a representative of the shipping company called Strathmore Holdings, and Lord Phineas Varcourt himself. Viscount of Strathmore, aged 34, holder of the largest single debt note against the Darrow estate, and a man who had, in Emmeline's experience, an extraordinary talent for entering a room as though the room had been waiting for him. He wore grey. He did not smile. He stood near the window, and when his gaze found Emmeline across the narrow office, he held it for precisely 2 seconds longer than courtesy required. She looked away first. That was the last time she did. Mr. Rowe read the will. It was as her father had described it to her in a quiet conversation the previous winter: the house, the dispensary stock, the South Wharf dock, and all contents to pass jointly to both daughters, with Emmeline as principal trustee. Simple. Clear. Her father had never been a complicated man. Then Mr. Rowe produced a second document. A codicil, he called it. An addendum to the will, signed, he said, 2 weeks before Mr. Darrow's death, transferring the South Wharf dock and the Harbour Road access that ran beside it to Strathmore Holdings in partial settlement of the outstanding debt. The room absorbed this with the quiet efficiency of people who had been expecting it. Emmeline had not been expecting it. She kept her face still. Beneath the table, her hands pressed flat against her skirt. She had never heard her father mention a codicil. She had been with him nearly every day of those final 2 weeks. He had been ill, but not insensible. He had not mentioned Strathmore Holdings. He had not mentioned signing anything at all. Before she could speak, Lord Varcourt rose from his chair. He addressed her with a bow so slight it was almost a statement. Miss Darrow. Given the circumstances, he said, I believe it would be in the interest of all parties, your family, the estate and the commission, if we were to discuss a more permanent arrangement. He paused as though the next words had been prepared carefully. I am prepared to retire the debt entirely, in exchange for your hand in marriage. The harbour commissioners nodded. One of the merchants exhaled with visible relief. Even Mr. Rowe permitted himself a small, satisfied press of the lips, as though he had arranged the furniture of someone else's life and found it pleasing. Miss Darrow looked at Lord Varcourt for a long moment. Then she asked him, in a voice so clear it reached every corner of that mildewed room, "Do you want the harbour road, my lord, or do you want me? I would be grateful if you could be plain about it before everyone here. Now, dear friends, I want you to picture that room. I want you to picture the commissioners, the merchants, Mr. Rowe, all of them watching a young woman with debts at her door and a solicitor's letter in her lap ask the most honest question anyone had uttered in that office in years." Lord Varcourt did not answer immediately, and in that silence everything necessary was said. If you are new to this fire and you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment I'd ask you to do it, because what comes next is the part this story has been building toward, and I would very much like you to be here for it. Miss Darrow set the codicil face down on the table. She did not sign it. She said no, and she left. It was raining in Bellwood Harbour that afternoon. Not the dramatic rain of stories, but the particular grey drizzle of the northern coast that makes everything feel both smaller and more honest. Emmeline walked home because the hired gig was not due for an hour, and she was not going to stand outside Mr. Rowe's building and wait. Her boots were not suited for wet cobblestones. By the time she reached Harbour Lane, the hem of her black morning dress was dark with water. Miss Delia was waiting in the doorway before Emmeline reached the gate. "Well?" Delia asked. Emmeline removed her gloves, he proposed. Delia's eyes went wide. "I refused." The candle Miss Delia was holding shook once. That night, Emmeline sat in her father's study for the first time since his death. She had been avoiding the room. She had decided she was not going to avoid it any longer. She opened every drawer. Most of what she found was expected: unpaid invoices, correspondence from creditors, harbour commission notices. But near the back of the lower cabinet she found a second ledger. Slim, covered in brown cloth, written in her father's own hand. It was not the household accounts. It listed names: 3 widowed fishermen's families, an elderly woman who had worked the dispensary counter until her hands gave out, 2 young men whose apprenticeship fees Mr. Darrow had quietly paid after their own fathers could not. He had been supporting them all for years. Some of the borrowing she had assumed was carelessness had been, in fact, deliberate generosity. Emmeline sat with that knowledge for a long time. Behind the ledger she found 2 letters. The first was addressed to Lord Phineas Varcourt and written in her father's hand, but never sent. In it, her father wrote plainly, the dock toll receipts from the South Wharf had been arriving irregularly for 2 years. He suspected Mr. Rowe of misrouting them. He was asking Lord Varcourt, as principal creditor, to audit the accounts before Strathmore Holdings acquired any further interest in the property. The second letter bore Lord Varcourt's seal. It too had never been delivered, perhaps intercepted, perhaps simply never forwarded on. It promised, in careful language, to freeze interest on the primary vault 3 years and allow repayment without any transfer of property. It described the dock as having clear income potential that ought to remain with the Darrow family. This was not the arrangement Emmeline had been living under. She was still at the desk when a knock came at the rear door. The man who entered was perhaps 60, wearing the kind of coat that had once been excellent and had since become honest. He introduced himself as Mr. Reuben Kell. He had managed the Darrow South Wharf until 6 months ago, when Mr. Rowe had informed him his position was no longer required. Emmeline offered him a chair. "Mr. Kell," she said, "tell me about the dock tolls." He told her. For 2 years, the tolls collected from vessels using the South Wharf had been deposited not into the Darrow estate accounts, but into the account of a company called Harbour Lane Trading, a name Emmeline had never encountered. Mr. Kell had kept his own parallel records. He had also, on the day of his dismissal, made a quiet visit to the town registry office and confirmed something important. The will of Mr. Bernard Darrow had been submitted for registry in September, and at that time it had contained no codicil. He placed a copy of the registry confirmation on the desk. Now, dear listeners, I have told you stories where the evidence conveniently arrives all at once, and I am aware that real life rarely obliges. But sometimes, truth leaves more records than the people hiding it imagine. That is what happened in Bellwood Harbour in the autumn of 1823. The truth had been sitting in a registry drawer, a private ledger, and an unmailed envelope, waiting for someone patient enough to look. Lord Varcourt came to Darrow House the following afternoon unannounced. Emmeline received him in the front parlour with Mr. Kell present and every piece of evidence arranged on the table before her. She showed him the letters, his and her father's. She placed the registry confirmation beside the forged codicil. She said nothing while he read. When he finished, he said, "I did not instruct Rowe to alter the will." Emmeline replied, "I believe you. I have not yet decided what else I believe." He accepted that. It was the first moment she thought there might be more to him than she had assumed. He told her then what she had not known. His uncle, Lord Oswald Varcourt, who managed the Strathmore family investment interests, had encouraged him to purchase the Darrow debt 2 years prior. There was a northern shipping canal being surveyed, Lord Oswald had explained. The most efficient inland route would require access through a stretch of harbour road that ran directly beside the Darrow South Wharf. The dock was, accordingly, the most strategically valuable piece of property in Bellwood Harbour, and most of its neighbours had no idea. "Did you know the dock had income?" Emmeline asked. "Yes." Lord Varcourt's voice was quieter now. "I was told it had stopped due to the recession. I did not verify it." "You did not verify it," she repeated, "because you did not need to, because a note of debt was verification enough." He looked at his hands. "Yes." "Did you propose in that office because you believed I would be too frightened to refuse?" He was silent for 3 full seconds. Then, "Yes, I believed the circumstances would answer for me. I mistook your situation for your will. Those are not the same thing." Miss Darrow said, "No, they are not." She thought later that it was possibly the most honest conversation she had ever had with a man she barely knew. That counted for something. She was not yet sure how much. 3 days after that, Lord Oswald Varcourt arrived at Darrow House in a black carriage, with a crest on the door and 2 solicitors at his heels. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, immaculate, and accustomed to rooms that arranged themselves around him. He did not acknowledge that Emmeline was the mistress of the house until she spoke first. "Lord Oswald," she said, "you have come to offer a compromise." He smiled, with the particular warmth of a man who has never needed warmth to work in his favour. "I have come to offer common sense." He placed a document on the table, transfer the harbour road access and the South Wharf deed to Strathmore Holdings. In return, I will retire the debt in full and give your family 6 months to vacate the house at their convenience. 6 months, said a quiet voice from the doorway. Emmeline had not heard her sister come in. Delia stood at the threshold in her grey morning dress, the one she had worn every day since their father's funeral. She looked at Lord Oswald and then at Emmeline, and something moved through her face. Not anger, not exactly, but the particular steadiness of someone who has been frightened for so long that the fear has finally burned down to its most useful form. She said, "She is right. We cannot sell what is not ours to sell." Her voice only shook a little. It was enough. Lord Oswald's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, the particular shift of a man who has been very certain and has just become slightly less so. Miss Darrow lifted the document from the table and placed it back in front of him. "No," she said. "Now, dear friends, if I were telling you a simpler story, this is where the walls would close in, where everything would become very dark before the dawn, and I will not pretend it did not become difficult. Mr. Rowe disappeared from Bellwood before the week was out. Documents went missing from his office. Lord Oswald initiated foreclosure proceedings through a separate instrument, claiming the debt note had been assigned to Strathmore Holdings some months prior. But here is the thing about people who conceal their methods. They must conceal them from everyone. That means they cannot compare notes when they are caught. The original will sat undisturbed in the registry office. Mr. Kell's parallel toll records were in Emmeline's study. The unmailed letter from Lord Varcourt to her father, promising a 3-year freeze, was in her possession, and Lord Phineas Varcourt himself, who had every reason to protect his family's reputation and none except conscience to destroy it, walked into the court of inquiry and told the truth. He admitted it without softening. He had purchased the debt partly because his uncle assured him the property would become valuable, and partly, and here the courtroom went very still, because he had met Miss Darrow twice at Harbour Commission dinners, and found himself hoping that proximity might become possibility. He had not said this to her. He had instead allowed her father's financial trouble to create a kind of gravity he had not earned. The magistrate looked at him over his spectacles. "You recognize that as improperly done?" Lord Varcourt said. "I recognize it as precisely the sort of thing a man convinces himself is helpfulness, because the alternative explanation is less flattering to him." Emmeline heard that from across the room. She did not look away. The codicil was declared fraudulent. The dock toll diversions were attributed to Rowe's firm, and through Rowe's firm to accounts controlled by Strathmore Holdings under Lord Oswald's direction. The assignment of the debt note was found to have been made without Lord Phineas's written authorization and was voided. Lord Oswald Varcourt was removed from the Strathmore Investment Directorship. The canal survey, confirmed in January, placed the primary access point directly beside Darrow Wharf, which now belonged unencumbered to the Darrow Family Trust. The debt, in the end, did not require Lord Varcourt's money to retire. The recovered dock tolls covered more than half. The canal company's access lease covered the rest. The arithmetic of Bellwood Harbour had been wrong all along, not about the value of what the Darrows owned, but about who held the power to decide its future. Lord Varcourt did not come to Darrow House for 6 weeks after the ruling. He sent only what was legally required: documents, formal notices, receipts. Each was addressed correctly. Each asked for nothing. Emmeline noticed his absence more than she would have preferred to admit. She converted the unused rear rooms of the house into a proper dispensary. Not the cramped shop of her father's time, but something larger, with a consultation room for women from the harbour district who could not afford the physician's fee. She hired a capable young assistant. She spent her evenings going through the account books with Delia, who had developed, it turned out, a quite remarkable instinct for numbers. Mr. Kell returned to the South Wharf. The Darrow Dock toll house was repainted. 3 vessels used it in the first week of December, and every penny of the toll was recorded, in duplicate, in a ledger that Emmeline kept audited herself every fortnight. She was not waiting for Lord Varcourt. She told herself this with considerable regularity. The Harbour Commissioner's annual winter dinner was held on the last Friday of January. Emmeline attended because Bellwood Harbour was her home, and its commerce was her business, and she had decided some weeks prior that she was done allowing discomfort to keep her from rooms she had every right to occupy. Lord Varcourt was there, near the windows, as he had been in Mr. Rowe's office 3 months before. When he saw her, he did not look away. He was asked to speak briefly about the canal development. He spoke clearly, without flourish, about the access agreements and the economic benefit to harbour families. And then, and the room was not expecting it, he said something else. He said, "Miss Darrow was described in this town as too desperate to refuse me." He said it without apology in his voice, which is to say with the particular kind of courage that does not dress itself up. "She refused me in front of witnesses," he said, "because I had arranged matters so that witnesses would be present. And because she did, I was required to examine what I had done rather than what I had meant to do. Those are not, I have come to understand, the same examination. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of recognition. The kind that settles over people when someone finally says plainly what they have all been circling. Miss Emmeline Darrow stood up from her seat. She crossed the room, past the commissioners, past the merchants, past the woman who had whispered in Mr. Rowe's office that poor Miss Darrow would certainly come to her senses, and she stopped in front of Lord Varcourt. She said, "Walk with me. There is something I want to show you." She looked toward the tall windows. Outside, the harbour road, the one his uncle had tried to take, the one the canal company had tried to purchase, the one her great-grandfather had built and her father had quietly preserved for her, was lit by the winter lanterns. He took his coat from the rack without a word. If you are waiting, dear friends, for me to tell you that they kissed dramatically in the cold harbour air while the canal survey pennants snapped overhead, I am afraid I must disappoint you. What happened on that harbour road on the last Friday of January was considerably less theatrical and considerably more important. They walked. They spoke honestly, for the first time, without lawyers or ledgers or the arithmetic of desperation between them. He asked her questions she had not expected him to ask. She answered them. She asked him questions he answered badly twice, and then, when she waited with the patience of a woman who had spent years listening to people who assumed she would eventually stop, he answered them better. That was how it began, quietly in the cold on a road that bore her name. I will not rush the rest. Emmeline Darrow and Lord Phineas Varcourt married in the following spring on a Tuesday morning. No orchestra, no county assembly, no audience who needed to witness anything, because Emmeline had already given Bellwood Harbour quite enough of a show in Mr. Rowe's office on Canal Street, and she had no interest in providing another. Mr. Kell and Delia were witnesses. The ceremony was at the small church above the wharf. The marriage settlement had been drafted by Emmeline herself, reviewed by a solicitor of her own choosing, and delivered to Lord Varcourt with a cover letter that said simply, "Please read every page before you agree to anything." He read it twice. He signed it without amendments. Darrow House remained in Emmeline's name. The dispensary remained under her authority. The South Wharf dock and all canal access income were held in a trust governed jointly by her and Delia, with Mr. Kell as independent trustee. No future creditor, no Strathmore Holdings subsidiary, and no husband, however well-intentioned, could touch it without 3 signatures and a full public accounting. Lord Oswald did not attend the wedding. He was, by that point, occupied with considerably more pressing matters. Lord Phineas moved into Darrow House. He was, Miss Delia informed Emmeline approximately 1 month later, less insufferable than she had initially planned for. Emmeline said she would take that under advisement. I think about Miss Emmeline Darrow sometimes, when the fire burns low and the story has reached the part that matters most. Not the hearings or the harbour road or the canal pennants in the January cold. The part that happens quietly after, the part that never makes the dispatches. She could have signed that codicil. She could have looked at the debt and the commissioners and the man with grey eyes near the window and decided that the arithmetic was the arithmetic. And that was all there was to it. She could have said yes in that solicitor's office, and no one would have blamed her. Everyone would have praised her for her good sense. She would have been called practical, reasonable, saved. But her father had kept a private ledger. He had paid apprenticeships for boys who had no one to pay them. He had mixed compounds at half price for fishermen who could not have managed full. He had built a dock with his own father's hands and intended his daughters to have the income from it, and not 1 penny of that intention was visible in the room on Canal Street, because the room on Canal Street had already decided what Emmeline's poverty meant. She refused because she knew the room was wrong. She refused because need is not consent, and desperation is not an answer, and a proposal made powerful by debt is not a proposal at all. It is a different kind of document, and she was not going to sign it. The harbour road in Bellwood still appears on the survey maps under its original name, not Strathmore, not Varcourt, not anything that arrived with a carriage and a crest and a document prepared in advance. Darrow Wharf, it reads Darrow Wharf. Emmeline made sure of it before she signed anything at all. If this story stayed with you, dear friends, if something in it felt true, then stay a while longer. Subscribe to Moonlight at Bellwood if you haven't yet. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a word in the comments. I read everyone, and on a cold night, your company matters more than you might think. There are more stories where this one came from. The fire will be here, and so will I.